You are drawing the attention of things far worse than a titan with a gauntlet. Like what, Dormammu? I know the name Sorceress. I've seen the end of the movie, Tony said, stepping into her space. He felt a surge of heat in his veins, a golden light flickering behind his retinas. But I also know that if I don't do this, Thanos wins. He wins and then he does it again. I'm not a ghost. I'm a correction. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from his forehead. Tony didn't flinch. The soul I see within you is weary. It carries the weight of a father, a husband, and a martyr. But this body belongs to a man who is still full of ego and fear. If the two do not merge, you will shatter. And when you shatter, the stones you used will seek a new host. Tony felt the room spin. The floor beneath him turned to glass, revealing a void of stars. Help me, not for my sake, for the timeline. I need to secure the Mind Stone without killing Vision. I need the Tesseract before Loki gets his hands on it again. I need to build a defense that doesn't just protect Earth, but protects now. The Ancient One sighed, a sound that seemed to last for centuries. Knowledge is a dangerous thing, Anthony. You seek to use the future as a blueprint, but time is a living thing. It will fight back. It will try to reassert the deaths you have prevented. Let it try, Tony whispered. I've already died once. I'm getting good at it. She pulled her hand away and the room snapped back to reality. The smell of old parchment and incense returned. I will not stop you. Not yet. But you must understand the price of your survival. To stay in this world, you must remain anchored. You must have something that ties you to the present, or the resonance of the stones will pull you back into the void from which you came. I have Pepper, Tony said instantly. Then tell her the truth, the Ancient One commanded. Not the partial truth of a paranoid man, but the whole, devastating reality. Honesty is the only anchor strong enough to hold a god-killer in the stream of time. If you lie to her, if you try to carry this weight alone as you did before, you will fade, and the world will fall with you. Tony felt a cold shiver. Honesty. It was the one thing he was worst at. He had spent his life building suits of armor, both literal and metaphorical, to keep people away from the broken parts of him. Now, the Sorcerer Supreme was telling him that the armor was the very thing that would destroy him. I can do that, Tony said, though his heart hammered against his ribs. We shall see, she replied, waving a hand. The doors behind him swung open again. Go, the Mind Stone is restless. It senses your return. And remember, Anthony, nature always demands a balance. For every life you save, the universe will look for a substitute. Tony walked out into the crisp New York afternoon, the sun reflecting off the glass of the nearby towers. He felt heavier now, more solid, but the warning echoed in his mind. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over Pepper's name. He had changed the past. He had saved Bucky. He had united the team. But as he looked at his reflection in the phone's dark screen, he saw the faint, ghostly shimmer of the stones behind his eyes. He wasn't just fighting Thanos anymore. He was fighting the very fabric of reality to earn his right to exist. He hit dial. Pepper, he said when she picked up, his voice trembling. I need you to come to the compound. I need to tell you everything. And I mean everything. The air in the private living quarters of the Avengers compound was thick with the scent of lavender and expensive stationery. A sharp contrast to the ozone and blood Tony still smelled in his dreams. Pepper Potts stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, her silhouette framed by the orange glow of the setting sun. She didn't turn when he entered, but her voice was tight. You canceled the meeting with Secretary Ross, Tony. You hijacked a Quinjet, flew to Siberia with Steve Rogers, the man you were supposed to be restraining, and now you look like you haven't slept since the turn of the century. Tell me what is happening. Tony didn't answer immediately. He remembered the last time he had truly seen her, in the quiet moments before he snapped his fingers, the way she had told him he could rest. He walked to the bar, but instead of pouring a drink, he gripped the edge of the marble counter until his knuckles turned white. The Ancient One told me that if I didn't tell you the whole truth, I'd fade away. And I'm not ready to leave you again, Pep. She turned then, her eyes narrowing in confusion. Leave me again. Tony, you're scaring me. He activated his palm housing, projecting a series of holographic files that weren't stored on any local server. They were neural recordings, filtered through the bleeding edge tech he hadn't even invented yet in this timeline. Images of a purple-skinned titan, a golden gauntlet, and a dusty, decimated Earth filled the room. Pepper gasped, stepping back. Then the images shifted. He showed her a small house by a lake. He showed her a little girl with messy brown hair and a smile that broke his heart into a million pieces. That's Morgan, he whispered, his voice cracking. Our daughter. She was born 3 years after the world ended. And she's the reason I did what I did. For the next hour, the words poured out of him like a ruptured dam. He told her about the snap, the 5 years of mourning, the time heist, and the final battle where he gave his life to bring everyone back. He told her that he was a ghost from a dead future, sent back by the very stones that had killed him. Pepper didn't interrupt. She watched the holograms of a future that felt like a nightmare, her hands trembling. When he finished, the room was silent. Tony felt lightheaded, the anchor the sorceress mentioned finally catching hold in the silt of the present. You died, she finally said, her voice a ghost of a sound. She walked over and took his face in her hands. You really died. I'm here now, Tony promised, leaning into her touch. But he's coming. Thanos is coming, and this time I'm not letting him get close. But I can't do it as the Accord's lapdog. I need the team, all of them. Pepper looked at the holographic image of Morgan one last time before it flickered out. She took a deep breath, the CEO of Stark Industries replacing the grieving woman. Then we better start making some calls. If we're going to defy the government and fight a god, we're going to need a very good legal team and a lot of backup. By the following morning, the compound's briefing room was more crowded than it had been since its inauguration. Tony sat at the head of the table, Steve Rogers and Natasha Romanoff flanking him. Around the table sat the core Avengers, but there were new faces, too. T'Challa stood near the door, his presence regal and steady. Sam Wilson and Rhodey shared a look of guarded curiosity. Then the doors hissed open, and a teenager in a science fair hoodie shuffled in, looking like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. Mr. Stark, you said there was an emergency. I have a Spanish quiz on Monday. Sit down, Pete, Tony said softly, the sight of the boy sending a pang of protective fury through him. You're graduating early today. Next came Scott Lang, looking bewildered in a suit that was several sizes too small for his nerves, accompanied by a woman with a sharp bob and an even sharper gaze. Hope Van Dyne, she introduced herself. My father didn't want us here, but Scott mentioned something about a cosmic apocalypse, and I figured that trumped his grudges. Tony stood, tapping the table. A massive 3D map of the galaxy appeared, with 6 glowing points of light pulsing in different sectors. Most of you think we're here to talk about the Sokovia Accords. We aren't. The Accords are a symptom of a world that's afraid because it doesn't know what's coming. I do. He didn't sugarcoat it. He showed them the same footage he had shown Pepper, but tailored for a tactical briefing. He showed them the Power Stone on Xandar, the Space Stone in the Tesseract, and the Mind Stone currently sitting in Vision's forehead. He watched the blood drain from Clint Barton's face as he saw the image of his family turning to ash. He saw Steve's jaw set into a hard line as he watched the Wakandon battlefield. This is a preemptive strike, Tony declared. We aren't waiting for the Black Order to arrive in New York or Edinburgh. We are going to secure the stones ourselves. We need the PIM particles for the quantum realm. That's our highway. We need Wakandan logistics for the extraction. And we need every one of you to be faster, stronger, and more united than we ever were in the life I lived before. You're asking us to become intergalactic thieves, Natasha noted, though there was a glint of challenge in her eyes. To go up against things we don't understand. I understand them, Tony countered. I've felt them. They aren't just rocks, they're the building blocks of existence. And right now, they're calling out to the biggest bully in the universe. If we don't move now, we're just waiting to die. Steve stood up, his gaze sweeping the room. The weight of leadership, which had nearly fractured the team only days ago, now acted as a binding force. Tony has seen the cost of our failure. I've seen the truth of what he sacrificed to give us this second chance. I'm with him. If this is the fight, then we fight it together. One by one, they nodded. T'Challa crossed his arms over his chest in the Wakandan salute. Scott Lang looked at Hope, who gave a curt, professional nod. Peter Parker just looked at Tony, his eyes wide but filled with a burgeoning resolve. Whatever you need, Mr. Stark. As the meeting broke into tactical subgroups, Vision approached Tony. The android's expression was uncharacteristically troubled. Tony, the stone. It has been singing since you returned. It knows you, but it also knows that you are seeking to change the unchangeable. Tony looked at the yellow gem. He knew he had to figure out how to remove it without killing his friend, a feat Shuri had almost accomplished in the other timeline. We're going to save you, Viz. We're going to save everyone. But first, we need to get to the sanctuaries. We need to find the Soul Stone before Thanos even realizes we're on the board. Outside, a storm was brewing over the Hudson, but for the first time in years, Tony felt a sense of clarity. The secret was out. The team was whole. He looked at his hand, it was steady. No glowing mandala, no phantom ash. He was anchored. Now it was time to go hunting for the stars. The tactical table at the Avengers compound didn't just display maps of Earth anymore. It was a swirling nebulas of interstellar coordinates and temporal ley lines. Tony leaned over the glass surface, his reflection looking 20 years older than the face he had inherited in this jump back. Knowledge was a heavy crown, but today he was sharing the weight. Steve stood opposite him, his arms crossed, watching the holograms with a focus that suggested he was finally seeing the world through Tony's eyes. Asgard is compromised, Tony began, his voice devoid of the usual snark. He swiped a finger, bringing up a flickering image of Asgard. Thor thinks his father is on the throne, presiding over the Golden Realm. He isn't. Loki is currently wearing Odin's face like a custom suit, while the real All-Father has been dumped in exile. If Asgard falls to its own internal rot, we lose the first line of defense against the Black Order. Steve frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. Loki, we saw him in chains. Thor took him home. Loki is many things, Rogers, but predictable isn't one of them. Except for the part where he craves a throne, Tony countered. He looked at Vision, who stood near the window, the Mind Stone glowing with a soft, sympathetic yellow. Vision, you're the only one who can bypass Asgardian glamours. You need to head to the coast of Ireland. There's a specific cliffside. I've seen it in the stars and the stones. Odin is there fading. He needs to know his sons are coming, and he needs to know Earth is no longer just a protected backwater. We're his allies now. Vision nodded, his cape fluttering as he solidified his form. The stone recognizes the signature of the All-Father, Tony. I will find him. But if what you say is true, the transition of power will be volatile. Everything is volatile right now, Tony said, then turned to Natasha and Clint. They were already geared up, looking like the shadows they were born to be. You too, the pager. I know Nick has it. He keeps it in a specialized box for the literal end of the world. Tell him the end of the world just moved up its schedule. He needs to summon Carol Danvers. Don't take no for an answer and tell him if he hesitates, I'll leak his secret boy band collection to the world. Natasha offered a ghost of a smile. Fury doesn't like being told what to do, Tony, especially by people who shouldn't know his secrets. He'll listen when you mention the name Goose, Tony said with a wink that didn't reach his tired eyes. Once Carol arrives, she's our scout. She can cover more light years in an hour than the Quinjet can in a decade. She needs to find the Guardians of the Galaxy. They're a ragtag group of idiots mostly, but they have the orb, the power stone. They don't know what they have, and they definitely don't know Thanos is already tracking them. Tell her to bring them here. To Earth, we need a unified front. As the duo departed for their clandestine meeting with the former director of SHIELD, Tony felt a sharp pull in his chest, a phantom memory of the snap. He ignored it, turning his attention to a blinking distress signal on a subfrequency no one else could hear. It was a rhythmic pulse, a ghost in the machine. "What's that?" Steve asked, stepping closer. "That's the big guy," Tony whispered. "Bruce. He's on a planet called Sakaar. It's a literal trash heap at the edge of a wormhole, ruled by a hedonist who calls himself the Grandmaster. Bruce has been the Hulk for 2 years straight in the timeline I left. He's a gladiator, Steve, a prize fighter. We can't win this without the strongest Avenger, and I'm not talking about the guy with the hammer." Tony tapped a command, and the floor of the lab hissed open to reveal a localized quantum tunnel, a miniature version of the gate they'd used for the time heist. It was crude, powered by a temporary arc reactor and PIM particles he'd borrowed with Hope's help, but it was enough for a surgical strike. "I'm going to get him," Tony declared. "If I leave the Hulk there, he never becomes the professor. He never helps us solve the equation for survival. I need to pull him out of the arena before he loses himself entirely." "Tony, you're spread thin," Steve warned, placing a steadying hand on Tony's shoulder. The trust between them was no longer a fragile thing of glass. It was becoming steel, forged in the heat of Tony's radical honesty. "You're trying to save the galaxy in a single afternoon." "I'm trying to prevent a funeral I've already attended," Tony snapped, then softened. "Trust me, Cap, I know the way. I've lived the failure. I'm not interested in a sequel." While Vision took flight toward the Emerald Cliffs of Ireland and Natasha's car sped toward a hidden bunker in the suburbs, Tony stepped into the shimmering blue light of the portal. The transition was a kaleidoscopic nightmare, a blur of subatomic space that spat him out onto a balcony overlooking a neon-drenched city of scrap. The air smelled of sulfur and ozone. Below, a massive arena roared with the sound of 1,000 alien voices. Tony checked his wrist-mounted HUD. The bleeding-edge armor rippled over his skin like liquid mercury. He wasn't the man in the iron suit anymore. He was a walking weapon of the future. He looked down and saw him, a massive, green engine of destruction standing over a fallen opponent, the crowd chanting champion. "Hey, Jolly Green," Tony muttered, engaging his thrusters. "Time to go home." Back on Earth, at a nondescript diner in New Jersey, Nick Fury sat across from Natasha and Clint. He looked at the pager on the table, then at the two assassins. "Stark sent you, with this." "He said the clock is ticking, Nick," Natasha said. "And he knew about the eye, all of it." Fury's remaining eye narrowed. He reached for the pager, his thumb hovering over the button that would call a woman from the stars. "If he's wrong about this, I'm billing him for the stress." "He isn't wrong," Clint said, his voice heavy with the memory of the future Tony had described, the ash, the silence, the loss of his children. He's the only one who's actually seen the sun go out. Press the button, sir. In deep space, a streak of binary light suddenly changed course. Carol Danvers felt the pulse of the beacon, a signal she hadn't expected to see for decades. She banked her flight, her eyes glowing with cosmic power, heading toward the coordinates of a small blue planet that was suddenly the loudest thing in the universe. In Ireland, Vision touched down on a windswept cliff. An old man sat on a rock, his hair white, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a father waiting for a storm. "You are not my son," Odin said, his voice like grinding stones, yet he didn't turn around. "I am a friend of your son's, All-Father," Vision replied softly, "and I have been sent to tell you that the cycle of Ragnarok has been intercepted. Anthony Stark sends his regards and a warning. The Mad Titan has already begun his march." Odin finally turned, his one eye gleaming with ancient, weary wisdom. "The mortal who walks through time. I have felt his footsteps shaking the roots of Yggdrasil. Tell him, the king of Asgard is ready to listen." The wind whipped across the Irish cliffs, but Vision remained as steady as the stone beneath him. Beside him, Odin Borson sat with a quiet dignity that belied his fading essence. The All-Father's eye was fixed on the horizon, watching the convergence of realities that only a king of his stature could perceive. Vision felt the Mind Stone pulse against his brow, a rhythmic warning. He knew they could not stay here. The vacuum of power in Asgard was a wound that would eventually bleed into the Nine Realms. "The mortal Stark possesses a vision that rivals the Heimdall of old," Odin rumbled, his voice like the shifting of tectonic plates. "To reach back through the tapestry of time and pluck a single thread to save a king. It is an act of profound arrogance, yet born of a desperate love." "He calls it survival, All-Father," Vision replied softly, "and he believes you are necessary for ours." Vision took Odin's arm, his molecular density shifting so they both became as light as the coastal mist. Within minutes, they were over London, descending toward a laboratory where Jane Foster sat surrounded by monitors tracking gravitational anomalies. When the synthezoid phased through her wall with the king of Asgard in tow, Jane didn't scream. She simply dropped her tablet. She had spent years looking at the stars, but she had never expected the stars to walk into her office looking for a way home. Using Jane's specialized equipment to amplify a signal through the Bifrost's residual frequency, they sent a flare into the cosmos. It wasn't long before the sky tore open. A bridge of rainbow light shattered the afternoon calm of London, slamming into the pavement outside the lab. From the shimmering heat stepped Thor, Mjolnir spinning in a nervous blur, and Loki, whose expression shifted from calculated boredom to absolute, unmitigated terror at the sight of his father alive and upright. "Father," Thor's voice cracked, the god of thunder looking more like a confused boy. "Thor, Loki," Odin said, his voice regaining its steel. "Your brother of Midgard, the Iron Knight, has seen a darkness you have yet to imagine. We go to Asgard. The shadows of our past must be quelled if we are to stand with the Avengers." Loki opened his mouth to lie, to weave a glamour, but one look at Vision, and the glowing Mind Stone silenced him. The stone knew the truth of his crimes in New York, and more importantly, it knew the future Tony Stark had described. With a heavy thrum of celestial energy, Thor raised his hammer, and the three of them vanished back into the Bifrost, leaving Jane Foster standing in the wake of a scorched earth and a newfound purpose. Back at the Avengers compound, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy thud of footsteps. Tony Stark stepped out of the localized quantum tunnel, his armor singed and covered in the neon blue grime of Sakaar. Behind him followed a man who looked like he had been dragged through a hurricane. Bruce Banner was trembling, his eyes darting around the high-tech lab with a mixture of terror and profound relief. "Tony," Bruce whispered, clutching a ragged cloak around his shoulders. "You said it was 2016. You said we had time." "We're making time, Bruce," Tony said, stepping out of his suit. He looked older than he had an hour ago, the temporal strain carving lines into his face. "Steve, get him some tea, a blanket, and a PhD-level physics problem. He needs to ground himself before the big guy decides to come back out." Steve Rogers was there in a second, his hand steadying Bruce's shoulder. The trust between them was no longer a question. It was the foundation of the room. But before they could settle the displaced scientist, the compound's early warning systems began to scream. Friday's voice filled the hall, urgent and sharp. "Boss, we have multiple atmospheric entries. One high-energy signature followed by a craft of unknown origin. They aren't slowing down." Tony sprinted to the window, the nanotech of his housing unit already creeping over his knuckles. A streak of golden-white light cut through the clouds, moving with a speed that defied conventional physics. It wasn't a missile. It was a woman. Carol Danvers descended like a falling star, her body wreathed in binary energy that turned the air to plasma. And trailing in her wake, appearing like a brightly colored dragonfly against the blue sky, was the Milano. The ship touched down on the lawn with a series of hissed vents and clanking struts. The hatch hissed open, and out stepped a group that made the Avengers look like a well-adjusted choir. There was a man in a red leather duster kicking a piece of debris, a green-skinned woman with a blade strapped to her hip, a hulking gray warrior laughing at the grass, and a raccoon currently arguing with a small, walking tree. Carol Danvers landed between the ship and the compound, her eyes glowing with the fire of the space stone. She looked at Tony, her expression unreadable. "Fury said you knew I was coming. He also said you knew about the guys trying to kill these idiots for a purple rock." Peter Quill, the man in the leather jacket, stepped forward, adjusting his blasters. "Whoa, whoa. We are not idiots. We're the guardians of the galaxy. And technically, we just saved a planet from a living egomaniac, so a little respect would be." "Save it, Quill," Tony interrupted, stepping onto the grass. He didn't look at the ship or the raccoon, he looked at Gamora. He saw the daughter of Thanos and felt the ghost of a cliff on Vormir. He felt the weight of the snap in his fingers. "We have the Power Stone." Gamora nodded slowly, her hand going to the orb at her belt. "It is safe for now, but he is coming. I can feel him moving through the stars. He knows we have gathered." "I know," Tony said, his voice dropping to a whisper of steel. "That's why I brought you all here. No more secrets. No more fighting each other over paperwork. We have the stones, we have the king of Asgard, and we have the heaviest hitter in the universe." He looked up as a second set of alerts began to chime on his HUD. High above the Earth's atmosphere, hidden by the curvature of the world, a massive, donut-shaped vessel was decloaking. The Black Order had arrived. Ebony Maw was descending upon New York, and behind them, the shadow of Sanctuary II began to eclipse the moon. "Tony," Steve said, stepping up beside him, his shield strapped to his arm. "The UN is on the line. Ross is demanding we stand down and surrender the alien assets to government custody. He's threatening to send in the military." Tony didn't even turn around. He watched the sky darken as the Q-ship entered the lower atmosphere. "Tell Ross he can have the paperwork when the sun comes up tomorrow. Until then, we're closed for business." He looked at the assembled team, the soldiers, the spies, the gods, the aliens, and the brilliant, broken scientist. For the first time in 2 lives, Tony Stark wasn't afraid. He had the truth, and for once the truth was a weapon more powerful than any stone. "Avengers," Tony said, the word echoing with the weight of a decade of grief and a second chance. "And Guardians, secure the perimeter. The endgame doesn't happen on his terms this time. It happens on ours. The sky over Manhattan did not scream. It groaned under the weight of a geometric nightmare. The Q-ship hung like a monolithic needle, piercing the low-hanging clouds and casting a shadow that felt cold enough to be physical. Tony Stark stood on the balcony of the newly fortified Avengers compound, his gaze fixed on the digital projection shimmering before him. Beside him, the air rippled as a hologram of Secretary Thaddeus Ross flickered into existence, his face a mask of purple-veined fury. "I warned you, Stark," Ross spat, his voice distorted by the localized jamming field Tony had established. "You've brought illegal combatants and extraterrestrial fugitives onto American soil. This is an act of treason. The military is 10 minutes out from your position. Stand down or be dismantled." Tony didn't look at the hologram. He watched the real-time feeds of the Sanctum Sanctorum in Greenwich Village, where Ebony Maw's craft was beginning its descent. "Thaddeus, listen to me very carefully," Tony said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Right now, there is a man in that ship who can rewrite your DNA with a flick of his wrist. If you send your boys in there, you aren't sending soldiers, you're sending appetizers. I'm not asking for your permission to save the world. I'm telling you to stay in your bunker, so I don't have to waste time clearing the wreckage of your ego out of the street." He closed the connection with a sharp gesture, the blue light of the hologram dissolving into the afternoon sun. "He won't stop, Tony," Steve Rogers said, stepping out onto the balcony. He looked different than he had in the timeline that ended in ash. There was no shield on his arm yet, but his posture was that of a man who finally understood the full scope of the battlefield. "Ross will prioritize the Accords over the atmosphere. He sees us as the threat because we're the only thing he can't control." "Then we give him something else to look at," Tony replied. He turned, the nanotech housing unit on his chest pulsing with a low, rhythmic amber glow. "Steve, this is the moment. In the other world, we were divided. We were fighting in an airport while the real war was being won in the shadows. Not today. You take Natasha, Sam, and Bucky. Get to the ground zero in the village. The Mind Stone is the target and Vision is the lure. They'll expect him to be alone. Show them he has a phalanx." Steve nodded, the trust between them now a tangible, heavy thing. "And the Power Stone." Tony looked toward the lawn, where Carol Danvers was already hovering, her body radiating a faint, heat-distorting aura. The Guardians were checking their blasters, Rocket Raccoon shouting instructions to a confused-looking Scott Lang. "Carol leads the intercept. She and Quill will take the Milano and meet that Q-ship in the upper atmosphere. They don't let it touch the ground. If Maw gets his feet on the pavement, the casualty count hits 6 figures in the first minute." "Peter," Tony called out. Peter Parker, wearing the advanced Iron Spider suit Tony had synthesized months ahead of schedule, swung down from the rafters, landing in a perfect crouch. "Yes, Mr. Stark. Ready for whatever this is. Intergalactic pest control." "You're with me, kid," Tony said, his face softening for a fraction of a second as he looked at the boy he had once lost. "We're going to the Sanctum. There's a surgeon there who doesn't know he's a wizard yet, and he's holding the keys to the kingdom. We protect the Time Stone at all costs. If that stone falls, we lose the ability to undo our mistakes." As the Quinjets roared to life and Carol ignited into a streak of binary fire, Pepper Potts stepped out from the lab. She didn't offer a platitude. She didn't tell him to be careful. She walked up to him and pressed a small, encrypted tablet into his hand. "The satellite network is ours, Tony. I've rerouted the Stark Industries grid to mask the Avengers' movements from the Pentagon. If Ross tries to lock onto your heat signatures, he'll find himself tracking a fleet of weather balloons over the Atlantic." "Go." Tony leaned in, his forehead resting against hers for a heartbeat. "I'm coming home this time, Pep, I promise." "I know," she whispered, "because you already know how the story ends." Tony's armor bled out from the housing unit, a shimmering tide of gold and crimson that encased him in a silhouette of future tech. He took flight, Peter trailing in his wake on a tether of reinforced webbing. They streaked across the skyline, a pair of falling stars heading toward the heart of the storm. Below them, the city was a hive of panic, but Tony's HUD was a masterpiece of redirected intent. He saw the heat signatures of the Black Order's dropships, the rhythmic pulsing of the infinity stones hidden across the globe, and the cold, vast emptiness of space where Thanos was surely watching. They reached the sanctum just as the air began to ripple with Ma's telekinetic presence. The street was silent, the cars abandoned, the wind whistling through the iron railings. Ebony Maw descended from the sky like a gospel of ruin, his long, gray fingers twitching as he sensed the power nearby. Beside him, the massive, hulking form of Cull Obsidian leveled a glowing hammer. Stonekeeper Maw's voice echoed, thin and sharp as a razor. "The great Titan finds your world cluttered. Relinquish the time stone and your deaths will be merciful. Resist, and your screams will be the only thing left of your civilization." Tony touched down, the thrusters of his boots hissing as they scorched the asphalt. He didn't wait for a witty retort. He didn't engage in the theatrics of his past self. He raised both hands, the nanotech shifting into high-output repulsor cannons that hummed with a frequency designed to disrupt telekinetic fields, a countermeasure he had spent 5 years in a dead future perfecting. "I've heard this speech before," Squidward Tony said, his voice booming through the external speakers. "It didn't age well the first time. Peter, Webb the big guy. Wung, if you're listening, open a portal to the Arctic. We're taking out the trash." As the first wave of Maw's psychokinetic debris flew toward them, Tony didn't flinch. He saw the geometry of the attack before it even formed. He was no longer just a man in a suit. He was a prophet in a cage of iron, and he was through letting the dark win. The battle for the stones had begun, but for the first time in history, the Avengers weren't reacting. They were hunting. The air around the Sanctum Sanctorum did not just vibrate. It screamed as Ebony Maw tore the very molecules of the atmosphere apart. Tony Stark, encased in a suit of nanotech that shouldn't have existed for another 7 years, watched the wreckage of New York rise into the sky like a slow-motion funeral. In his previous life, this was where the end began, the moment the needle moved toward the grave. But Tony was no longer a man reacting to a nightmare. He was the architect of the dream. "Peter, high ground." "Now," Tony barked, his HUD highlighting the trajectory of a dozen hijacked taxicabs Maw was hurling through the air. The Iron Spider suit flared to life, Peter Parker's enhanced agility allowing him to dance through the chaos. Tony didn't wait for the debris to clear. He accelerated, his thrusters leaving a trail of blue ion fire, and slammed into Cull Obsidian before the behemoth could bring his chain hammer down on Wung. "You're in the wrong zip code, big guy," Tony muttered, his repulsors firing at point-blank range, tuned to a frequency that resonated with the creature's dense physiology. Ebony Maw drifted through the carnage with a terrifying, serpentine grace. "Your powers are quaint, Stark," Maw hissed, his fingers twisting the air into a knot of telekinetic pressure. "You play with metal and sparks while we serve the fundamental laws of the universe. Give me the stone, or I will peel this city like a fruit." Tony landed, the asphalt cracking beneath his boots. He looked up at the Q-ship looming above Manhattan, then at Wung, who was already weaving the golden embers of eldritch magic. "Wung, remember the plan, the Siberian Protocol?" Tony asked. Wung's expression was grim. "It is a violation of every natural law to use the mirror dimension as a cage, Stark. The resonance could shatter the city. Better a shattered city than a shattered universe, Tony replied. Do it. I'll provide the anchor. Tony reached into the subroutines of his armor, activating the prototype sling sync, a device he had spent the last 48 hours calibrating with the help of the Mind Stone's residual energy. As Wang began the complex gestures to fold reality, Tony punched a command into his gauntlet. A series of nanotech pylons shot from his back, embedding themselves into the street in a hexagonal pattern. They hummed with a low, rhythmic pulse, acting as gravitational anchors to prevent the mirror dimension from bleeding out into the physical world. "Peter, get back," Tony shouted. With a sound like 1,000 mirrors breaking at once, the world inverted. The sky folded over itself, the skyscrapers of Manhattan bending into a kaleidoscopic geometry of glass and steel. In an instant, the screams of the city vanished, replaced by a crystalline silence. They were no longer in New York. They were in the reflection of it, a place where the laws of physics were a suggestion rather than a rule. Ebony Moss stumbled, his telekinetic grip on the real world severed. He looked around at the infinite, repeating corridors of the city, his composure finally slipping. What is this sorcery? It's called home field advantage, Tony said, his voice echoing from every surface of the folding world. You think you're the only ones who know how to play with the fabric of reality. I've seen the end of time, Squidward. I've seen what your boss does to the stars. You aren't taking a single pebble from this planet. Cull Obsidian roared, lunging forward, but the mirror dimension responded to Tony's anchors. The street beneath the giant's feet rose like a tidal wave, tossing him into a maze of shifting balconies. Tony didn't give Ma a chance to recalibrate. He engaged his thrusters, but instead of flying straight, he used the warped geometry to appear from 3 directions at once, a trick of refraction he'd learned from studying the Time Stone's echoes. Knowledge is a burden, isn't it? Tony whispered, his voice coming from the air itself. Knowing exactly how you lose. Knowing that your Titan is just a man with a glove and a god complex. He slammed a heavy-duty containment unit into the ground, a modified version of the trap he had used on the Guardians in another life. The device emitted a localized gravitational well, pinning Maw to the side of a building that was currently facing downward. The alien priest gasped, his long fingers clawing at the air, but the mirror dimension was a vacuum for his particular brand of influence. This is for the 5 years of silence, Tony said, his repulsors glowing with a blinding, white-hot intensity. For the kids who turned to dust. For the heartbeats that stopped. We're done losing. Tony unleashed a sustained beam of energy, not at Maw, but at the structural nexus of the folded space. The mirror dimension buckled. The Black Order was pulled into the recursive loop of the dimension's core, trapped in a mathematical prison that would take 1,000 years to solve. As the dimension collapsed back into reality, Tony and Wang stood in the center of a silent, untouched Greenwich village. The Q-ship above was already being dismantled by Carol Danvers, her binary form a streak of gold through the alien hull. Steve Rogers, Natasha, and Bucky were on the ground, securing the perimeter with a level of coordination that the old timeline had never known. Tony felt a sharp, familiar ache in his chest, the ghost of the stones. He looked at his hands, they were steady. He looked at Peter, who was high-fiving a bewildered-looking Scott Lang. He looked at Pepper, who was watching from the compound feed, her face a mixture of terror and fierce pride. Tony Steve's voice crackled over the comms. The big guy is here. Africa. He's bypassing the orbital defenses. He's going straight for the source. Tony looked up. The sky was darkening, but not with clouds. A purple rift was tearing open over the horizon. Thanos was coming, but he wouldn't find a grieving widower or a fractured team of fugitives. He would find a planet that had already seen his victory and decided to rewrite it. "Let him come," Tony said, his voice steady and devoid of the fear that had defined his life for a decade. "We aren't the Avengers anymore, Steve. We're the ones who survived. We're the ones who know." He felt the weight of the future, not as a burden but as a weapon. He had told the truth, he had trusted his friends, and he had used every scrap of his cursed knowledge to build a fortress out of time itself. As the mad Titan stepped onto the soil of Earth, Tony Stark didn't reach for a sacrifice. He reached for his team. "I am Iron Man," Tony thought, watching the purple light of the space stone flare in the distance. "And this time, I'm staying for the sequel."